Mommy, where are you?
If you're anything like me and you cannot wait for Halloween, I've got absolutely terrifying movies you can currently catch on Max. Now, it's worth noting the full list of all the movies we're talking about can be found in the top pinned comment down below, along with where you can stream these movies in a variety of countries, because most of these will only be available on Max here in the US. This video is sponsored by Raycon, but I'll tell you more about them later in the video. Right now, we're going to talk about one of the lesser known movies on this list that's only a few years old now, The Hole in the Ground. Now, the director of this movie would go on to do a bigger budget movie that's actually further up on this list, but this is a chilling movie. And a lot of that is just pure atmosphere. This has got a really creepy mood. You follow a mother and her young son who are kind of trying to get away from an abusive relationship, and they go live out in this house out in the woods, and then really weird stuff starts happening. She begins to notice all sorts of strange things with her son, and while there are hints of things I've seen before, The Hole in the Ground definitely went in a different direction I wasn't expecting, and again, it's just really well directed. I mean, this list has got some real bangers on it. This is a solid pick to be all the way at the back. But for one that's a little bit more mainstream, The Crazies is actually a remake of a 70s movie by the same name, and as far as horror remakes go, The Crazies is an exceptional one. Not only do you have a great cast led off by Timothy Olyphant here, but it too has a really creepy mood and feels a lot like a zombie movie, but The Crazies goes in a slightly different direction, and it makes all the difference, making it feel like something that could happen. This concept has a little bit in common with M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening, one of his more terrible movies, yet The Crazies really kind of nails a somewhat similar concept much more perfectly. But I said all of that to say that next up on this list is what I consider to be M. Night Shyamalan's scariest movie. Now, some of you may disagree, and it's not necessarily my favorite movie from him, but I still think Signs has some of the scariest moments in it, especially for a mainstream PG-13 movie. Now, you do have to be quite patient with Signs. There's not really anything scary in the first 2/3 of the movie. It's all build up. And then when you finally do get to the scary part, it doesn't really hit as hard as like a rated R movie might. Yet, M. Night Shyamalan actually did a really good job making this movie scary without actually showing you very much. Signs holds up as kind of an old-fashioned type horror movie. It's one of the ones on this list that's for scaredy cats. If you kind of like horror movies but just don't want the crap scared out of you, Signs is a fantastic way to go. One of the more terrifying movies on this list is also the newest movie on this list and the newest movie added to Max, and that is Evil Dead Rise. Now, this is a sequel to the Evil Dead reboot that came out almost 10 years ago now. And it's cool that Max has every Evil Dead movie. They've got the original trilogy, including Army of Darkness, the reboot, and the brand new one I'm about to talk about. And the reason the new one makes the list of the most terrifying movies is because it's one of the scariest ones. The older ones I love more. While they are scary, they're campy, and they have a lot of fun with all the special effects, and they're just kind of a wild ride. Evil Dead Rise is a wild ride too, but it is unrelentingly creepy. They actually did a fantastic job casting this. There's almost no one recognizable in it, yet the woman that plays the main villain in the movie, as beautiful as she is in normal life, she is haunting to look at in this movie. And that's really kind of all the marketing and trailers had going for it, but this movie's actually packed with a lot of fantastic horror references, and even if some are on the nose, they're kind of perfectly on the nose. There's some real gross out references to effects in the original series, but there's also one of the best references to The Shining I've ever seen. It's very overt, you cannot miss it, but it's cool as hell. So Evil Dead Rise is actually packed with things for horror movie lovers, yet it is a total gore fest, loaded with real practical effects, some of the most realistic blood I've ever seen in a movie, and not for the faint of heart. But if you passed on this one and you've been a fan of any other Evil Dead movie, I'm telling you, this is well worth watching. But Max actually has another new release that I think is even more terrifying and even more clever and creative, Barbarian. This was a surprise hit in the theaters last Halloween, and I can totally see why. It is worth noting it takes quite a while for this one to get started, but it's easy to get into because there's quite a bit of mystery at the beginning of this movie, and you're expecting something to happen at any moment, and it is fantastic if you can be patient. Now, when the payoff finally kicks in, whoo, it's a doozy. And as interesting as the beginning of the movie is, and as disturbing as the end is, there's also a little bit of levity too. You've got Justin Long in a pretty good role, and he's funny at times, just enough to keep it light at moments, and then they really do go to some dark places with this one. Again, but it's always in a clever and creative manner, which just won big points for me. This is one of the better horror movies I've seen in recent years. Now, if you clicked on this video, there's a good chance you like being scared, and if you want to take these movies up a notch, you can obviously watch them in the dark. That always works, but if you want to take them up another notch, also watch them with a good pair of headphones, like today's sponsor, Raycon. Here are my everyday earbuds, and Raycon offers a variety of different styles, and they're all great for music, podcast, audiobooks, you name it. Raycons offer the same top quality audio that you get from big name brands for half the price, less than half the price in some cases. Which means you could get a spare pair or a gift for somebody and still pay less than you would for some of those premium brands. And as someone who owns another premium brand of headphones and used to exercise with them, I can tell you while they didn't necessarily fall out all the time, they would move and I was constantly fidgeting with them. Raycons stay in place unlike any other pair of earbuds I've ever had. And they don't just sound as good as premium headphones, they have premium features too. One of my personal favorites is noise isolation mode, which does a great job of blocking out outside noise. But they've also got an awareness mode that lets outside noise in so I can hear my kids and still listen to my music. And in this economy, Raycon wants to make sure you're super happy with your purchase, which is why they offer easy, free returns and even have buy now, pay later options. To get yours, go to the link in the description or just go to buyraycon.com/flickconnection and get 15% off your Raycons. Again, that link is in the description, or you can just type in buyraycon.com/flickconnection and you're gonna get 15% off, an already great deal. But speaking of great stuff, let's talk about the rest of the scary movies on this list. My next pick not only comes from South Korea and was not only from the same director as Snowpiercer and Parasite, but it's also one of the better references to Godzilla movies I've ever seen. It's titled The Host. Now, in this movie, a large amphibious creature emerges from the water one day and begins wreaking havoc, and it's all just incredibly well directed. This is a top-notch movie, and the first half of the movie is a fantastic sort of disaster/monster movie. Yet, as you dive deeper into this movie, it becomes a really fantastic mystery and almost adventure story, making it a total cult classic. If you've yet to really get into movies from South Korea, they make some amazing stuff there, this being one of the better horror movies I've ever seen out of that country. And then my next pick is the closest thing I've ever seen to a modern day Stanley Kubrick movie. In fact, it's the closest thing I've seen in the 20 some odd years since he's died. Under the Skin, directed by Jonathan Glazer. Now, I don't expect that name to sound too familiar to most of you because he's only done a handful of movies, one of them Birth with Nicole Kidman and Sexy Beast with Ray Winston. And Under the Skin is not for everybody. In fact, a lot of people do not like this movie. My guess is because they're constantly waiting for something to happen. Under the Skin is much more under the surface. Now, that doesn't mean there's nothing happening, but you do have to look pretty closely. It's all very subtle in a very Kubrick kind of way. But visually stunning, this movie has some of the most arresting moments I've ever seen put to film, and the way they filmed it is just super interesting. Scarlett Johansson is actually driving this van around. She's somewhat unrecognizable with that long, curly brown hair, but she's actually trying to pick up random men on the side of the road. So a lot of the guys you see are just real people, and some of them actually get into the car thinking a beautiful woman has picked them up. Yet the premise of this movie is that she is an alien, and she's taking men back to her lair to somehow devour them. Super creepy stuff, incredible mood with this one. This is the only real art film on the list, so if you don't really do movies like that, this is not gonna be for you, but if you've somehow not discovered this one yet, and you like Kubrick or anything weird like that, then this could be one of your new favorite movies. Now, most of the movies so far either feature something supernatural or at the very least a real off-the-wall situation. However, my next pick is the closest thing to something that could really happen. In Green Room, a young punk rock band takes a gig at a white supremacist bar way out in a remote location. Their second mistake would be going back to the green room after the show, even though they were told not to, where they witness something horrible that they shouldn't have seen. At that point, they're not allowed to leave that green room, and there goes your movie. They become trapped and have to figure their way out. There's a lot of clever elements to this, some real dynamite performances, including a top-notch villain from Patrick Stewart. I think if you're a fan of his from any point in his career, you need to see what he does in this movie, even though this is a dark one. You've also got one of Anton Yelchin's final roles before he died, and really a career best for him. This one's technically a thriller, but it really goes into some horror directions, making it a great fit for this list, but also the least like a horror movie out of everything on this list. Guillermo del Toro makes the list with one of his more underrated movies and one of his earlier horror movies, Kronos. Now, this movie is mixed language. There's some English in it, but for the most part, it's in Spanish, and you're gonna have to read subtitles because for whatever reason, Max doesn't like to put out dubbed versions of movies, but this is an incredible movie. And on top of all of that raving, it's a vampire story that's different from any other vampire story I've ever seen, and don't forget, I watch almost everything. But Kronos stands out for several reasons. The mechanism in which this man becomes a vampire is interesting enough, and then what his life becomes as a vampire is much more interesting than most other vampire movies. Now, the thing about Hereditary is it borrows from a lot of other movies or stories. It takes things and it sort of turns them on their heads, which is what makes it such a good horror movie, or at least such a highly praised movie. And it's not just that you don't quite know what's going to happen. There are a lot of movies that do that. Hereditary not only surprises you, but it ultimately surprises you with how so many of the weird things add up to actually make sense for the story. Meaning you're not just dealing with jump scares or shocking imagery. The wild stuff that takes place is actually glued together pretty well and elevates the story and helps move it forward. Hereditary is not the first movie to do that, but it does it in spades, whereas so many other horror movies just go for the scare factor. This is easily one of the more intellectual horror movies released in the past decade, and it works kind of as a crowd pleaser too, which is pretty amazing if you ask me. My number one pick is one of the greatest body horror movies of all time, David Cronenberg's remake of The Fly. Now, the cool thing about The Fly on Max is they have the original from the 1950s, which I also highly recommend. It's a really cool science fiction flick. There's a little death in it, there's a morbid themes, but that one is fairly accessible for the family. The David Cronenberg version from the 80s with Jeff Goldblum is not friendly for the family. In fact, it is not one for the faint of heart. But what makes it good is it's not a gross out movie just for the sake of being gross. All of the really disgusting elements actually fit with this story quite well and really elevate a lot of the themes, making it a much better movie than the original, even though I still do recommend that movie as kind of a fun, campy 1950s flick. But this version is a top-notch 80s horror flick, easily one of the best from that decade. That is the list. Thanks to Raycon for sponsoring another video, and I will keep making these as long as you keep watching them. But thanks for watching this special summertime horror episode, and you will see me on the next one.